When an elderly Washington man dies from a fall, no one suspects his in-home caretaker until her involvement in several other deaths is discovered. Suspicion over his death is raised as the remains of murder victims are unearthed from a serial-killing couple's backyard in this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening to Last Seen Alive. I'm your host, Leah, crime analyst by day and true crime storyteller by night.
And as always, I'm your co-host, Scott.
A quick heads up. This episode contains discussion of offenders who tortured their victims, demonstrating extreme indifference to human life. Please listen with care. James McClintock, who also went by Mac, was last seen alive on February 9th, 2002. He was 81 years old at the time and lived in Raymond, Washington. Raymond is a small town on the western edge of Washington state with its roots in the fishing and logging industries. It's home to just a couple thousand people now and was home to a little less back in 2002. Raymond abuts the Willapa River. In fact, the river runs right through the town, dividing it into two distinct halves, north and south, united by a bridge. Those of you who've listened to our episode on the unsolved disappearance of Luke Pyongdai have already heard us talk about that bridge and this town. It's the same small town that Luke disappeared from in 1996.
I was going to say, it sounds really familiar.
Yep, we've been here in another episode not that long ago. But with that being said, to the best of my knowledge, investigators do not believe the cases are related. It's only the setting that's the same. By 2002, James, or Mac, as many around town knew him, had lived in Raymond for some time. He was a widower and shared his modest home with his best friend, a black Labrador retriever named Sissy. In his younger years, James had served in the U.S. military during World War II and had even been present at Pearl Harbor on the day of its bombing.
It's crazy to think of people that were around for that and that were at that location on that day.
Yeah, James had seen a lot, some very historic moments. And after his military service, he'd gone on to work at sea as a merchant crewman. After retiring in Raymond, he lived a slower life. James acquired some mobility issues as he grew older and could often be seen traversing Raymond's streets in his electric wheelchair. He would ride it to the grocery store and back, and for a while, that's how he maintained his independence. However, as he aged into his 80s, he eventually conceded that he could use some help. Unfortunately, though, he didn't have any family in the area. According to an article published in the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, it's believed that James may have met Michelle Notek, who also went by Shelley, at a social services office in a nearby town where she was employed. That office was known as the Olympic Area Agency on Aging in Aberdeen. There, Michelle's job as a case aide entailed connecting elderly clients with information on social service programs that might be of help to them.
Okay.
James was a client at the office where he received assistance in dealing with Medicare. However, according to reporting in the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, James didn't qualify for Medicare-funded in-home care, which meant that if he wanted in-home assistance, he'd have to pay for it himself. Michelle was in her 40s and seemed sympathetic to James' situation. Conveniently, her own residence was located just a few miles away from his. Plus, Michelle had recently lost her job at the office, having been fired that summer due to, quote, consistently poor performance, end quote, and for being, quote, unreliable and inconsistent, end quote, according to reporting for the Seattle Times.
That's incredibly inconvenient for him.
Well, when you don't qualify for government or insurance-funded care and you have to pay out of your own pocket, the options are slim.
You do what you can.
Yeah. So Michelle and James ended up striking an agreement in which she would routinely come by his home to help out as a caretaker. That was in September of 2001. Michelle was, ostensibly, an experienced home caretaker. She wasn't professionally employed anywhere in that capacity, but she offered such services on her own as a type of self-employment. She specifically catered to people like James, elderly people who didn't qualify for government-funded in-home care, but were willing to pay out of pocket for some assistance. She and her husband, David Notek, who worked in construction, lived in a farmhouse on Monahan Landing Road, which is a rural road just outside the town of Raymond. Their 4-acre property was, like much of the land around it, dotted with fir trees and not far from the banks of the Willapa. With Michelle's help, James no longer had to ride his wheelchair back and forth from the store to get groceries. However, this would prove to be a poor trade-off. James had no way of knowing this when he took Michelle on as a caregiver, but if there had been an award for the worst caregiver in the Pacific Northwest, Michelle almost certainly would have decimated the competition in the early 2000s. In fact, had there been a Lifetime Home Care Villain Award, she would have snagged that too, no question. Well, Michelle and her husband David both. The two of them worked together to commit crimes that even most hardened criminals would likely find unthinkable. Michelle and David Notek didn't limit themselves to elderly victims. Anyone in need or vulnerable would do, but an elderly person like James with no family presented an easy target for them. According to reporting for Como 4 News, neighbors reported hearing Michelle screaming at James in an abusive manner on more than one occasion. And while that's bad enough, it was barely even the tip of the iceberg when it came to the kind of abusive behavior she was capable of. Unfortunately, the extent of her misdeeds wouldn't be discovered until it was too late, both for James and for several other people. James died on February 9, 2002, about 6 months after hiring Michelle Notek as an in-home caregiver. The cause of his death was blunt force trauma to the head, specifically an acute subdural hematoma, and Michelle told authorities that he'd fallen out of his wheelchair. And this seemed plausible since James had, obviously, mobility issues and he was a known fall risk. It was why he used a wheelchair in the first place, and he had fallen out of the chair before on many occasions. The medical examiner who performed James' autopsy found his cause of death to be that subdural hematoma and his manner of death to be undetermined.
Okay.
The uncertainty reflected in that finding would be multiplied the following year when 2 women reached out to authorities with disturbing allegations. A quick side note here. When police arrived on scene at the fall that ultimately took James' life, he was still alive and still conscious. He died shortly thereafter, and he did not say anything about being abused or purposely harmed. And some have thought, well, maybe it really was an accident because of that. But I would like to point out that he had just experienced massive head trauma and had a brain bleed going on that would ultimately prove fatal. So I don't think that's necessarily proof either way. He would be very confused and stunned in that state, I'm sure.
He would likely be concussed, and whenever we're dealing with anybody with any kind of concussion or head trauma, you have to ask the most basic of questions: where they are, what day is it, who's the president, things like that.
Right.
Very basic questions, and at times even struggle with answering those very simple things.
Sure, we've seen that many a time in the past when we worked as EMTs. It's very possible that if he was intentionally harmed, he may not have known. He may have had no idea what hit him. Anyway, those women who reached out to authorities were Michelle and David's 2 oldest daughters, Nikki and Sammy, who were adults by that point. Michelle and David also had a 14-year-old daughter who still lived at home at that point, and investigators would eventually speak to her too. It was the 2 oldest daughters, Nikki and Sammy, though, who, after speaking to their younger sister who still lived at home, reached out to local police and initiated what would turn out to be an intense investigation. According to court documents, when they first spoke to investigators, they told them that their parents had been abusing a man named Ron Woodworth. Ron, who also sometimes went by Woody, was a 57-year-old man who had moved in with the Noteks as a boarder. Intelligent and educated, he'd served in the U.S. military during the Vietnam War in his younger years, and had afterwards secured a job with the U.S. Air Force as a civilian. It had been a good job, but eventually Ron had left in order to move from California to Washington. At some point, according to reporting for the Seattle Times, Ron began to experience notable mental decline. He started acting strangely and neglecting his hygiene. Most likely, he was suffering from some kind of serious mental illness, but Scott, I don't know whether anyone knows what kind of illness it might have been. Seemingly, he never got the help he needed for it.
Okay.
By all accounts, Ron became known around town as an unusual guy. Reporting for the Seattle Post-Intelligencer gives this example, Scott. Quote, "One neighbor said Woodworth would often hide in ditches and jump out at people." End quote. Now, Ron also loved flashy jewelry, rings in particular, and could reportedly read Egyptian hieroglyphics.
Interesting.
One of his friends described him as an expert on Egyptology. Yes, he was a mentally ill guy by this point in his life, but he was also very intelligent. Anyway, when he wasn't dishing out jump scares or studying the writings of ancient cultures, Ron sometimes got into some legal trouble. As his financial situation worsened, he was charged several times with writing bad checks and was subject to protective orders taken out on him by several different people around Raymond. Whether any of those protective orders had anything to do with the jump scares, I don't know for certain, but I have my suspicions.
I could easily see somebody just not wanting to deal with it and taking a protective order out on it.
Sure, and maybe that was it. I don't know. No one has publicly said. What I do know, though, is that Ron ended up becoming estranged from his family. After being evicted from his own home, he'd moved in with his mom. Eventually, though, he moved out of her home in order to move in with the Notex, who had befriended him. In particular, Michelle had befriended him, and the two became close. Ron would even help her take care of her elderly in-home clients. After moving out of his mom's place, Ron allegedly harassed his own mom so badly, writing her angry letters and reportedly stalking her because he didn't think she was taking good enough care of his cats, that she ended up taking out a protective order against him. So, by the time Ron vanished while living with the Notex, no one really noticed, which is presumably exactly what the Notex were counting on.
It really does open up a range of opportunity for them.
Definitely. When the two oldest Notek daughters told investigators that their parents had abused Ron, investigators made a trip to the Notek residence. One article I read described their farmhouse as looking like something out of Country Living, but I personally think that's more than a little generous. In any case, investigators went there and Ron was nowhere to be found, at least not without a search warrant, which investigators did obtain. However, they weren't on their own when it came to looking for Ron. When confronted, David Notek confessed to investigators that, yes, he had buried Ron in their backyard, and he led them to the body.
Okay, sudden change of heart?
Yeah, when it comes to the couple here, Michelle and David, David is definitely the weak link. He talked a lot, but there was a catch. He claimed that he had only buried Ron in the backyard after Ron had taken his own life.
Okay.
Naturally, investigators were, to say the least, intensely suspicious of this claim. As far as they were concerned, although Ron's treatment at the Notek residence had been horrific enough to perhaps drive someone to suicide, Ron had not taken his own life. Rather, he'd been murdered. Investigators spoke to witnesses, some of whom had previously been afraid to talk. With Ron found to be missing and then deceased, though, they were less reluctant. It seemed as if everything that had gone on in the Notek household had finally come to a head and the truth could finally be told. And what those witnesses had to say about Ron's life with the Noteks was heartbreaking. According to court records, prosecutors alleged that Ron died as a result of the abuse Michelle and David subjected him to. And much of that abuse is best described, frankly, as torture. According to witnesses, Michelle and David forced Ron to do outdoor labor on their property, sometimes while wearing only his underwear. Bizarrely, they also reportedly would force him to jump from high heights onto sharp gravel, causing injuries to his feet, including broken bones. And then, also according to court documents, they would intentionally inflict severe burns on his already injured feet by pouring boiling water over them.
Yeah, torture might be an understatement.
Yeah, it was some really sick stuff. Investigators were sure that the cause of Ron's death had been abuse inflicted by the Noteks, not suicide. What's worse, they were also pretty sure that he had not been their first victim. More on that next. And now, back to James' story. When investigators found the remains of Ron Woodworth buried in the backyard of Michelle and David Notek's home, they were certain that the couple had murdered Ron, despite their claim that he had committed suicide. They were also pretty sure that Ron hadn't been their first victim, and their investigation would reveal that they were correct. He hadn't been the first, or even the second. The Notek's first known victim was a 36-year-old woman from California named Kathy Loreno. Like all of the Notek's known victims, Kathy was someone who they befriended during a difficult time in that person's life and ultimately ended up inviting to live with them at their farm home. Kathy was, by all accounts, a very sweet person. Her childhood had been marked by the tragedy that had been the death of her dad, who died in a freak accident at work. Later, when Kathy was an adult, her mom remarried only for her stepdad to then die in a car accident.
Okay. That's a lot of random deaths of her father figures.
Yeah, she and her family had definitely experienced some hard luck. After that, Kathy and her mom moved out of California together, seeking a fresh start somewhere where the cost of living was lower. According to reporting by Unsolved, Michael Coe, and Mary Spicuzza for the Seattle Times, they settled in South Bend, Washington, which is literally just a few minutes down the road and down the river from Raymond. These two communities are right next to each other, almost one and the same.
Okay.
According to that same reporting, Kathy struggled to find her place in South Bend. She'd grown up a short distance outside of LA, and to say that life was different in South Bend would be an understatement. The town was gorgeous, there was no doubt about that. But for Kathy, it was tremendously difficult to fit in among the town's less than 2,000 residents who all seemed to already know each other. Even as she worked as a hairstylist at a local salon, Kathy felt like an outsider. And then Michelle came along. At first, her friendship seemed like exactly what Kathy needed, a real breath of fresh air. But that was because Michelle was employing a technique known as love bombing. This is something that abusive people often do at the beginning of relationships. Often, those relationships are romantic, but they don't have to be. This manipulation tactic can also be used in platonic relationships, which is what happened here. At this point, Kathy presumably had no idea that some residents of the area referred to Michelle as Crazy Shelley because of her volatile personality. Eventually, Kathy and her mom, who again lived together, had a disagreement. The disagreement was over a man who Kathy had begun dating. Her mom thought he was bad news and cautioned her daughter to stay away from him. Kathy, who was approximately 30 at that point, felt her mom was overstepping her boundaries and decided it was time to move out of their shared residence. Kathy's mom, who was just trying to help, might have been on to something with her warnings, though, Scott, because there was another person in Kathy's life who her mom warned her she'd be better off without, Michelle Notek. At first, Kathy crashed with a friend named Carolyn, who she sometimes babysat for. Up until meeting Michelle, Carolyn had been her only friend in the area. However, when Michelle heard about this, she was quick to offer up a different solution. Why didn't Kathy just move in with her family? It would be better than staying at Carolyn's place. In fact, Michelle insisted that Kathy move in. She didn't even need cash for rent. She could babysit the Notek kids in exchange for room and board.
Definitely capitalizing on the opportunity she's created.
Yes. Kathy made the move in 1988, at which point the two oldest Notek daughters were still children and Michelle was pregnant with the youngest. At some point after Kathy moved in, Michelle's behavior changed. The initial love bombing campaign ended and the side of Michelle that some called Crazy Shelley emerged. Michelle began isolating Kathy from her family as well as her other friend, Carolyn, and Kathy was subjected to continuously escalating abuse similar to what we've already discussed in relation to Ron's case. Michelle would sometimes still treat Kathy kindly, but only intermittently, presumably in an effort to keep her from fleeing. According to witnesses, and to be clear, Scott, when I use the term witnesses in this episode, I'm usually referring to the Notek's children who lived in the Notek home and were essentially hostages, forced to witness terrible things, although to a lesser extent, some neighbors and other community members did witness things as well. Most of the witness information comes from the Notek daughters, though.
Okay.
In any case, according to witnesses, over the course of the following 6 years, Kathy was tortured and abused to death. She'd been in good physical health when she'd moved in with the Noteks, but that changed. Here's what investigators allege the Noteks did to Kathy, according to court documents. They, quote, 1, hit and slapped Loreno, including numerous blows to the head. 2, dragged her across the ground. 3, pulled her hair. 4, poisoned her. 5, forced her to submit to bizarre treatments, such as bleach and salt to clean her wounds, and ingesting salt and prescription medications. 6, forced her to live and work outdoors in harsh weather conditions while minimally clothed or naked until she became hypothermic. 7, starved her. And 8, as punishment, forced her to immerse herself in cold water or mud. As a result of this abuse, Loreno lost 100 pounds, her hair and teeth fell out, and she declined physically and mentally. Near the end of her life, Loreno could not walk or talk. One side of her face drooped, her vision had declined significantly, and she was covered in vomit. End quote.
That is all extremely abhorrent.
Very extreme. As for why anyone might want to do these things, ever, to anyone, here's what one of the No-Tech daughters has said, according to reporting by Gina Tron for Oxygen. Quote, Kathy was a pleaser and never did anything to trigger such treatment. Michelle delighted in making other people hurt. It made her feel superior. She has never been formally diagnosed as a psychopath, but showed all the traits. End quote. And the No-Tech daughters would know because, unsurprisingly, they too were subjected to terrible abuse. They say their mom was incredibly controlling and cruel. For example, she'd force them to do things like roll in mud unclothed while she sprayed them with cold water from a hose.
I've been waiting for them to be the subject of her abuse. I can only imagine how traumatic their childhood must have been.
Yes, they suffered as well. They were definitely among Michelle and David's victims. The two oldest No-Tech daughters were forced to grow up this way, and the youngest endured her mother's abuse until she was removed from her custody at age 14. The oldest daughters witnessed the abuse of early victims like Kathy, and the youngest witnessed the abuse of Ron Woodworth. Back to Kathy's story, though. In 1994, 6 years after moving into the No-Tech home, Kathy was officially reported missing. Her mom was the one who made the report after not having heard from her daughter for what seemed like too long, even with Michelle in the picture. She even took out missing person ads in a local newspaper, hoping that someone somewhere in the community would have information about Kathy's whereabouts. For anyone who would like to see one of those ads that Kathy's mom took out and paid for out of her own pocket, we've posted a clipping on our website. The link is in the show notes. Kathy's brothers took it a step further and hired a private investigator. When approached regarding Kathy's disappearance, Michelle would alternately claim that Kathy had run away with a trucker or moved to Hawaii. According to court documents, Michelle even forged fake letters and sent them to Kathy's family members, hoping they'd believe that they really were from Kathy. However, they did not fall for it. After trying, without luck, to locate Kathy, the private investigator eventually concluded that she had to be deceased, and that the No-Techs were the only real possible suspects in relation to her presumed death. Kathy's brother Eric would later tell the media that, quote, "We've had closure since '95. We've all known she was dead," end quote. And Kathy's brother Jeff would say, quote, "She was the nicest person in the world, so sweet and darling. I can't believe anyone could have done this to her," end quote. And Scott, you're probably wondering whether anyone went to police with these suspicions.
I can only imagine they did.
Yeah, the answer is yes, they very much did. Not only did Kathy's family report her missing and express their concern that she had died, numerous relatives of the No-Techs also reached out to law enforcement repeatedly, alleging that Michelle and David had killed Kathy.
This is one of those times where it's hard not to just say, what the hell? How is law enforcement failing at such a colossal level?
Well, to everyone's frustration, law enforcement did not seem to take the reports very seriously. At least not until years later when it was discovered that Kathy and David had killed Ron Woodworth. Only then did police seriously investigate the disappearance of other victims in this story. The sheriff of Pacific County would later say that up until then, they hadn't had enough information to take significant action.
You've got families making these claims. You've got relatives of the caretaker making these claims, and nobody's actually investigating it. No, it sounds like you're just being lazy. It's not that there's not enough information to open a case here.
I agree. In any case, investigators say that Kathy died as a result of the abuse she was subjected to. David No-Tech claims, according to what he told investigators on at least one occasion, that Kathy ultimately died when Michelle struck her on the head with an iron. Another time, according to reporting for Como 4 News, David claimed that Kathy had died of asphyxiation, having choked on her own vomit. So David's stories weren't always consistent. In any case, David also told investigators that after Kathy's death, he and Michelle burnt her body and scattered the ashes on a beach. However, this doesn't necessarily make technical sense. As I know you're aware, Scott, it takes incredibly high temperatures to burn a human body to the kind of ash that would go unnoticed if scattered on a beach. In fact, professional crematory ovens don't even do that.
No, it's many, many hours at an incredibly high heat.
Right. Now, it does seem possible, though, depending on the tides and currents, that if skeletal human remains were dumped on shore, they might be carried out to sea and perhaps never seen again.
To that point, you could even take it just a few feet into the water and they'd be gone forever.
Yes, very possibly. Now, although to the best of my knowledge, Kathy's remains have never been located, according to some court documents, investigators say that the No-Techs did burn Kathy's body, but that they buried the remains in their backyard. Specifically, David is said to have buried Kathy's remains with the help of another victim who was forced to participate. That other victim, the No-Tech's second known victim, was the No-Tech's own nephew, Shane Watson. Shane was in his late teens when he moved in with the No-Techs in 1993, which was the year before Kathy was reported missing. He was from Tacoma, Washington, where he lived with his parents until they'd gotten divorced. Now, this divorce had been very ugly, so ugly that rather than living with either parent, Shane had gone to live with his grandparents. Shane struggled emotionally after his parents' divorce, and he started to get into some trouble. So his family decided to send him to live in Raymond with his Aunt Michelle and Uncle David, thinking that the change of scenery and life and, a family home with other kids would do him some good. Shane really loved the outdoors and working outside, so their little farmhouse on 4 acres of land seemed like the perfect place for him to decompress and find some balance in life. Unfortunately, the change in scenery did him anything but good. Shane moved into the No-Tech home during Kathy's final months, by which point she was in dire condition. He was horrified by the abuse he witnessed, horrified and apparently determined to do something about it. He surreptitiously snapped a photograph of Kathy's injuries and hid this from Michelle and David. At least for a little while, then Michelle found the photo. According to reporting for the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, in a fit of rage, Michelle beat Shane upon making the discovery. Approximately 2 weeks later, David confronted Shane over the photo and ended up fatally shooting him.
Fatally shooting your teenage nephew?
Yes, and he admitted that to investigators. And he also claimed that he burnt Shane's body and scattered the ashes on a beach. What really happened to Shane's body, I don't know. To the best of my knowledge, his remains have yet to be found. Maybe they really are somewhere at sea. As for Shane's grandparents, they came by the No-Tech home on multiple occasions wanting to visit him, but he was never there. Michelle always had a story ready to tell them. For example, she told them he'd left their home to move in with a girlfriend or to work on an Alaskan fishing vessel. So those are the No-Tech's 3 known victims, Kathy, Ron, and Shane. The question is, was James their 4th victim? That question remains officially unanswered, despite the fact that investigators took a fresh look at his death after all this came to light. One thing is for sure, though. There was definitely a reason why the No-Techs might have wanted James to die. Scott, you know how Sissy the lab was James' best friend?
Yes.
Well, he loved Sissy so much that he included her in his will. In fact, his will was all about Sissy. James wrote his will around the time he hired Michelle as a caretaker. In it, he left Michelle, who he described as a friend, thousands of dollars which he specified that she was to use to support Sissy, who would be left in her care in the event of his death.
Of course.
Yeah, that wasn't all, though. The will went on to say that as long as Michelle cared for Sissy, after Sissy's death, Michelle would inherit James' house.
Okay.
And guess what, Scott? After James' death, Michelle took Sissy in and took possession of several $1,000s meant for her care. 6 months later, though, she reported that Sissy, too, had died.
I am not surprised by that at all.
Yeah, this meant that Michelle had fulfilled her end of the bargain and was all set to inherit James' home, which was valued at $140,000. That's equivalent to just under $250,000 in today's money. So the No-Techs gained control of the home, listed it for sale, and eagerly awaited a 6-figure windfall. Meanwhile, they reportedly stole James' identity using his social security number along with those of several other people.
Of course.
There's a twist, though. Scott, I'm sure you and everyone listening are assuming the worst when it comes to Sissy, which is perfectly rational considering what we know about the No-Techs.
My first guess is poisoning, especially given their other victims.
Well, I am happy and frankly shocked to be able to tell you that the No-Techs did not kill Sissy. As far as anyone knows, they actually took good care of Sissy, as well as several other animals residing in their household. Seemingly, they only abused human beings. But when all of their crimes began to come to light and their youngest daughter was removed from their custody, their animals were all removed from the home too. Wouldn't you know it, one of those animals was an older female black lab who just so happened to be indistinguishable from Sissy.
Okay.
Now, Sissy had not been microchipped, so investigators couldn't prove absolutely that the dog was Sissy. However, it seemed extremely likely to those who had known the dog, including her veterinarian. Seemingly, the no-techs, on top of their more heinous crimes, had committed fraud in order to inherit James' home.
I am surprised that it's fraud. I definitely expected the worst, but
yeah,
honestly, given the amount of abuse they subject humans to, I'm really surprised they didn't warm up on animals.
Yeah, I'm surprised that they drew the line anywhere. I mean, they abuse their own children. So, a local volunteer animal care association ended up suing the no-techs on Sissy's behalf, as did the local sheriff who'd been a neighbor of James, as well as the administrator of his estate. The no-techs never got to cash in on James' home. But really, that was the least of their concerns because they were facing major criminal charges in relation to, the multiple murders they'd committed. Michelle and David were both charged with a slew of crimes, including first-degree murder, in relation to the deaths of their 3 known victims. They were arrested and jailed with their bond initially set at millions of dollars each. After their arrests, more and more information came out about the couple. Family members described Michelle as a volatile, dishonest person and recounted things she'd done in the past. For example, once, according to her stepmom and her daughters, she'd shaved off her own eyebrows and faked cancer. David, Michelle's stepmom alleges, went along with the fake cancer scheme, even though he knew it wasn't true. Reportedly, David went along with every scheme of Michelle's, no matter how cruel, bizarre, or morally reprehensible. Some have portrayed his cooperation as the actions of a beleaguered man who was worn down by the demands and behavior of a crazy wife. For example, David's mom, in a fit of parental denial, spoke to reporters for the Seattle Times and, quote, accused her daughter-in-law of threatening and duping her son into participating in abuse, death, and concealment at their home, end quote. David's mom went on to say that her son's marriage had been an unhappy one, but that David was a loyal man and had stayed in the relationship largely for the children who, remember, Michelle was also abusing. Here's the thing, though. David was a grown man, and no adult of sound mind gets duped into torturing people to death inside their own home over the course of years, or into fatally shooting their own nephew. Maybe he was pressured by Michelle, sure, but he was not duped. He did those things knowingly. His murderous actions were a choice that he made. He willingly went along with it as Kathy starved and suffered from the effects of poison. He was complicit as Ron was forced to labor outdoors, unclothed in the bitter cold. And when Kathy poured boiling water over his broken feet, he didn't even intervene when Michelle tormented their own children, dousing them with frigid water as they were forced to roll in mud. And of course, he fatally shot his own nephew. Whether or not Kathy wanted him to do those things is totally irrelevant. The point is that he willingly did them, which is exactly how the court saw things, of course. For David, there would be no hiding behind his wife, no crazy Shelley excuses. He would be held responsible for his actions. David Notek ended up pleading guilty to second-degree murder in relation to the shooting death of his nephew, Shane, and also pleaded guilty to the unlawful disposal of human remains. He was sentenced to just under 15 years in prison. As for Michelle, although she was originally charged with first-degree murder in relation to the deaths of Kathy and Ronald, prosecutors eventually decided they wouldn't be able to prove first degree in court and dropped those charges down to second-degree murder. She was also charged with manslaughter. In response to the charges, she ended up entering an Alford plea, which is a plea that allows a defendant to acknowledge that a jury would almost certainly find them guilty of the charges against them without actually admitting their guilt. So basically, it's a way for a defendant to say, I'm not saying I did it, but I'm sure a jury would conclude that I did, so let's just get on with it.
Yeah.
For her crimes, Michelle was sentenced to a combined total of 22 years in prison.
That's all?
That's it. And guess what, Scott?
She's out now?
Yeah, Michelle didn't even serve her entire sentence. In November of 2022, she was paroled at age 68 after serving just 19 years. As for David, who only received a 15-year sentence, he's free as well. Both of these people, despite responsibility for the prolonged sadistic torture and murder of multiple innocent victims, are totally free.
The U.S. justice system at work, people.
Yeah. In my opinion, Scott, the only thing as incomprehensible as the torment they put their victims through is the idea that anyone would find it appropriate to release an offender like Michelle early. Yes, she's older now, 70 at the time of this recording, but she's not ancient, and she's notoriously dishonest, manipulative, and cruel. Why release her early, giving her the chance to potentially reoffend?
She's completely able and capable of committing heinous crimes. She has no remorse. I would be shocked if she doesn't reoffend.
On that note, a heads up, Michelle and/or David may be going by different names now. So far, no one has been charged with any crime in relation to the death of James McClintock. His manner of death officially remains undetermined. If you know anything about the death of James McClintock, please call the Raymond Police Department at 360-942-4120. And if you found this story to be of special interest, you may want to check out our episode on the unsolved disappearance of Luke Pyongdae. The two cases aren't related, but they both happened in the same town. We aired our episode on Luke's case in August of 2024. You can scroll back to then in our feed to listen if you'd like.
That's all for this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening. Make sure you check out our website, lastseenalivepodcast.com, for photos from the story and links to the sources we used to write it. While you're at it, follow us on Insta and Twitter at LSA Podcast and our TikTok, Last Seen Alive Podcast. Episodes of Last Seen Alive air every Monday. See you then. And if you think bringing unsolved cases like James to the public's attention is important, please take a moment to rate or review Last Seen Alive and tell your friends to check us out too. We'd really appreciate it. Also, don't forget to check out our merch store where you can get an LSA t-shirt or hoodie. We donate 50% of the proceeds from every sale to the DNA Dope Project. As always, Last Seen Alive is written and researched by you, Leah. Audio engineering and editing is provided by me, Scott.